assassination of President Kennedy, including, they say, one of Oswald's cheek. They said the cheek test might prove whether he had fired the rifle recently. Results of the test were not announced immediately, and a police department spokesman said a bag of half-eaten chicken and a soft drink bottle were found near the spot from which the fatal shot was fired, but that there were no plans to pump Oswald's stomach to determine if he had eaten chicken recently. Secretary of State Dean Rusk and other high-ranking American officials were on their way to the Far East when the tragic news was radioed to them in flight. They immediately turned around, made a stop in Honolulu, and took off shortly thereafter for the return flight to Washington. They are expected momentarily at Andrews Air Force Base, so we go to Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington and NBC's Herb Kepler.
Secretary of State Rusk leads the party down the ramp, shakes hands with the Chief of Protocol, Angier, Biddle, and then Undersecretary of Commerce, Franklin Roosevelt, Jr., Undersecretary of State George Ball, Deputy Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Alexis Johnson. Other members of the Cabinet, Commerce Secretary Hodges, Interior Secretary Udall, Agriculture Secretary Freeman, Treasury Secretary Dillon, Labor Secretary Willard Wirtz.
Those of us who have had the high privilege of serving closely with President Kennedy will always cherish the gallantry and the wisdom and the grace with which he carried his awesome and lonely responsibilities. This is a great nation with great strength and much unfinished business. And one of our greatest Americans is now present. President Johnson needs and deserves our fullest support as he takes up these high responsibilities on behalf of all of us Americans.
We're about to wind this up for tonight because about all that could happen on one day has. For some final reflection on one of the more horrible days in American history, you find there is a great deal that could be said about the political and other changes we can look forward to now, but I think it would be bad taste to go into that now, and I won't. It has all been shocking, but perhaps one element in the shock was the speed. By the Washington clock, at a little after 1 o'clock this afternoon, President Kennedy was about as alive as any human being ever gets. Young, strong, vigorous, looking forward to, no doubt, 5 more years, he hoped, of leadership in this country and of the Western world. His wife, young, beautiful, looking very happy, was beside him and seeming to be having a wonderful time and leaning across the back seat of the car to say to him, "You can't say Dallas hasn't been friendly to you." And that was a little after 1 o'clock. 5 hours later, at 6 o'clock, Mr. Kennedy had been murdered. Lyndon Johnson was President of the United States. Mrs. Kennedy was a widow, a brave and composed one that nobody could fail to admire. All of them were back in Washington, returning in the same airplane that took them to Texas to an incredible tragedy. And the sheer speed of it was just too fast for the senses. Roosevelt, dead of a stroke, came back here from Warm Springs, Georgia, in a train, the sides of it draped in black crepe. It steamed majestically across the southern landscape toward Washington, taking a little time about it and giving everybody a time to think a bit about what had happened. But not today. There is seldom any time to think anymore, and today there was none. In about 4 hours, we had gone from President Kennedy in Dallas alive to back in Washington dead, and a new president in his place. There is no more news here tonight, and really no more to say, except that what has happened today has been just too much, too ugly, and too fast. Frank?
Thank you, Dave. The Dallas Police Chief, Jesse Curry, announced just a few moments ago that charges of murdering President Kennedy have been filed against Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old former Marine with a history of connection with left-wing causes. Now we would like to go to WBAP-TV and Robert MacNeil with some reports on the late developments in connection with Oswald and some of the preparations that had been made at the branch of Vice President Lyndon Johnson for what was expected to be a weekend of campaigning and relaxation. So to WBAP TV and NBC's Robert MacNeil.
The president's death has left one group of people at least, and especially in stunned confusion. A story from Charles Murphy.
No city was more saddened by today's events than Austin, the state's capital and the home of the wounded governor. Austin City Auditorium was to have been the setting tonight for a gala $100 a plate political banquet. Hundreds of persons who would have attended the dinner had already arrived in the city. Preparations for the thousands of guests stopped suddenly when the tragic news was heard. The dinner was to have been the final public ceremony for Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy on their Texas trip.
The 24-year-old prisoner who has been under questioning by Dallas police for over 8 hours has just been formally charged with the murder of President Kennedy. But the prisoner, Lee Oswald, has not admitted the shooting himself, and Dallas Police Chief Just Curry describes him as a stoic individual who admits nothing. He believes he's being held because he once lived in Russia. Oswald, who said 2 years ago he wanted Russian citizenship, was fined $10 recently in New Orleans for distributing communist literature. He's married to a Russian woman who was brought to the police station with their small daughter and his mother, who lives in a Dallas suburb. She was also questioned and said, "I am heartbroken about this. He is really a good boy." Oswald's only comment to the world at large since his arrest has been a denial.
Oswald, did you shoot the president? I didn't shoot anybody, sir. I haven't been told what I'm here for.
You have a lawyer?
No, sir, I don't. I just been...
Look back, you want to go to?
Police Sergeant Gerald Hill describes Oswald's capture.
Appreciate it. P.C. Walker, Bob Carroll, Paul Bentley, K.E. Lyons, myself, and other officers went into the building, and we began a systematic check of all the suspects or all the people who were in the theater. As Officer McDonald approached a suspect sitting on the third row from the back of the theater, the suspect jumped up, yelled, "This is it," and took a swing at the officer. Officer McDonald started to grapple with the man as he reached for a gun which was concealed under his shirt, and the gun was fired one time by the suspect, but luckily it misfired. The pin hit the shell, but it did not fire. McDonald yelled for help. The other officers in the theater and I managed to subdue the man, disarm him, and handcuff him. At that time, we brought him out of the building, put him in a squad car, and brought him straight to homicide and robbery and turned him over to Captain Fred. Who were those officers?
So although he has not yet admitted the shooting, the suspect Lee Oswald has been formally charged with murdering President Kennedy. Circumstantial evidence puts him in the room from which the shots were fired. Lab tests are being conducted to prove that he fired the murder rifle. Robert MacNeil, NBC News, reporting.
Violent death is no stranger to the family of Joseph P. Kennedy. Along with great wealth and political triumph, many tragedies have come to this Irish-American clan from Boston. Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., the elder brother of the assassinated president, was lost